So good evening, you Italian goats. Good to have you along on the channel today. We are going to be going through the poles of the world. This is a really exciting two-part series I have for you guys. I've put a lot of effort into making this map and making this document here, which has all these different poles all categorized neatly for you guys. So these resources will be in the description. There's going to be a ton of useful information here. Obviously on No Moving Games, poles are some of the biggest clues. And so if you learn these, you're definitely going to drastically improve and outpace your opponents on things like duels. This is particularly geared towards people who are less advanced, but even for advanced players, there are things I discovered here that I've never heard anyone talking about. So I think everyone will benefit from this. I originally recorded the video as one big part, but then I thought actually, because about half the video is taken up by Europe, we're going to focus on Europe for this video. The legend for the map is over here. Essentially, for Europe, what's relevant is that we have brown for wooden poles and grey for concrete poles. And you can see that Europe is a concrete pole dominated country, but there are all kinds of different styles of poles. And so that's what I'm going to be taking you guys through today. They're very recognizable in some regions. In other regions, you're going to have to rely more on other clues. But regardless, if you watch this, you're going to improve massively at European poles. Okay, so we're starting off with the United Kingdom here. United Kingdom, as I said, tends to use wooden poles. And one thing about United Kingdom poles is that they often have like these pegs running down the sides of it. There are other countries that do this, but UK commonly does that. And here's another example of what a UK pole would look like. And they often have yellow warning stickers on them, which is the same as Ireland. Ireland also has yellow warning stickers on about half the poles. And so that I would say is more common in Ireland and the British Isles. So you can take that into account when you're playing a no moving panning or zooming or something game like that. And really, when I'm talking about these tips, they're most useful for no moving games because in a proper moving game, you can use much better clues such as signage, whereas this is much more useful for the limited formats. Okay, moving on to France. France has a really good mix of poles, but we're moving away from wooden poles. They do have wooden poles, but they're mostly using concrete ones. Here is what you would call like a waffle pole or a sectioned pole, as I like to call it. And in France, you have short sections, and you can see they run all the way up to there. And this is the most common form. And then you also have just wooden poles. And the great thing about French poles is that they often, especially the wooden ones, often have a blue sticker on them. And that's basically the only country to do that. So if you didn't know that, definitely pay attention to that one. That will get you a lot of free rounds. So definitely heed that advice. Here is another French pole. This one's just like a solid concrete block, kind of like an ugly pole in my opinion. But another good thing about French poles is they often have metal brackets around the pole. And this is one of the only countries in Europe to commonly have metal brackets around the pole. Unfortunately, Belgium also does, as we'll see in a minute. But yes, they often have these metal brackets all around the pole. So quite useful there. And here is what I would call this is a French pole top. And it's a bit different to the more standard French pole top, but this one I do believe is mostly found in France, at least. I have not seen it in many other countries. So this one's kind of the more French version. And then this one I'm calling the French pole top. It kind of looks like a lat pull down bar. That's the way I remember it anyway. And this you'll see in France, but also in a lot of Francophone countries. So we're going to see this one in Senegal later. I believe you also see it in, trying to think of other countries that use it, like Madagascar, I believe you'd also see this one in sometimes. So yeah, definitely worth remembering that this is kind of the Francophone pole top, and you will see that quite commonly in France, but also elsewhere. Okay. Now we are in Wallonia, in Belgium, and we have this pole, which kind of looks like a tie pole, which we'll see later on, and it has dots all the way up, and it is square and concrete, and this one is really quite common to see in Belgium. Here's another one. So here's the other variation that has kind of short holes that go all the way through, so it's not like a section pole. I'd call this a holy pole, and the poles are kind of more circular and more more circular than you would see elsewhere in Europe. So you can see this one in France as well, but this one might be more common in Belgium. And between this one and this one, that's probably most of the poles you'll see in Belgium, full stop. So definitely worth paying attention to. And here you can also see the Francophone pole top in Belgium. Unfortunately, it might look slightly different. I don't really know. That there's lots of different variations of this pole top, but yeah, you can see it all around in Belgium and France. Okay, speaking of that same pole top, we're now in Spain, where you can also see the same pole top. And this one, I would actually say, even though it's a French thing, and I call it a French thing because it's used in lots of the ex-French colonies, but it's worth paying attention to the fact that it's probably more common in Spain overall. They're quite common around the landscape there, and this is also on a concrete pole. So let's take a look at that kind of pole more closely here. It's a section pole, concrete. I wouldn't say it's too different to the French one at all. So maybe if we can, there might actually be a small difference difference, not that I could notice at least. I would have had to have a bigger sample size to ascertain that. And also in Spain, it's quite common to see these kind of big mesh. I'm calling these ones mesh metal poles, and you'll often see those in the distance in Spain. They're a country that likes to use those, and particular countries like to use them much more than others, so it's worth paying attention to. Okay, now we are in Portugal, and Portugal uses very similar poles to the Brazilian poles. Surprise, surprise. But they have circular these round holes throughout them inside the section. So this one is simultaneously a section pole and a holy pole, which is pretty cool. Well, at least to a GeoGuessr player. But yeah, you can also see this very similar pole in France and Belgium very rarely. I had both of them recently, and so don't put all your eggs in this basket. But this one is the most common pole in Portugal for sure. Another common pole is the similar one, which is sectioned. It also has smaller holes in it, and it's much thinner. And then combined with this like kind of standard wooden pole, that is, from what I looked at, they're basically the three poles that constitute all of Portugal. I mean, of course, there'll be exceptions, but these seem to be easily the three most common. You got the thick one with the bigger holes, you got the thin one with the smaller holes, the two section poles, and then like just the standard wooden ones, which you can also quite often see in Portugal as well. Okay, so moving on to Italy, which is a country that doesn't use too many poles. I kind of almost debated putting this Italy in red because, yeah, Italy certainly does not use that many poles. But here we have a rounded pole made of concrete, and yep, this one's definitely like probably the most common, I think, in Italy, and you definitely see those standing alone. And as you'll see in the video, in the rest of the video coming up, this is the pole of the world. Like, it tends to be the most common pole everywhere, this one. And so you couldn't really use this to identify Italy unless you were kind of tossing up between Spain or Portugal, where you wouldn't see this pole very often. But as you'll see in the rest of Eastern Europe, for example, it's very common. Okay, here's another one. It's just a standalone wooden pole. You can see that quite often in Italy as well. And here is what I would call what I'm going to call for the rest of the video an Italian pole top. It kind of has these this lower bracket and a top bracket, and they have 6 bulbs on them. And you can see this one in Italy relatively commonly, and we're going to see that it's actually quite common in Eastern Europe as well. For example, I believe North Macedonia, Serbia, and Albania all use this pole top as well, perhaps in addition to others. Okay, and also Italy is a type of country that likes to use their big mesh metal poles. Very common in Italy, and that's kind of like explains why often they don't have too many road poles just near the town. I'm no electrician or city planner, but that's my layman's explanation. Okay, so here is now we're in the Nordics, and I can't remember if this one, basically all the Nordics, Finland, Sweden, and Finland, Sweden, not Denmark. Denmark doesn't really use many poles at all, but Finland, Sweden, and Norway all use these kind of standalone thin wooden poles. So you can see here are 3 of them. Occasionally they're gonna be A-frame. I would say A-frame might be most common in Finland and quite common in Sweden as well, but all 3 of them you can see A-frames, which is this with this style here where one's leaning up against the other, and all 3 of them you can just see wooden poles majority of the time. Indeed, all these countries don't use too many poles either. Alright, so that is Western Europe. Now let's move on to Eastern Europe. Okay, moving on to Central Europe and the Baltics. Here we are in Czechia, and Czechia uses this kind of round pole that we talked about earlier. Often in Czechia and Slovakia, you'll have these metal brackets around poles as well, so that could help you distinguish it from other countries in Central or Eastern Europe. And here is a second Czech style one. We also have a concrete pole, but we have this kind of detached bulb thing on top. And this detached tri-bulb thing, Czechia, Slovakia, and Albania are the main countries in which I've seen it. I've seen it elsewhere as well, but they're the ones that use it most of the time. And so it can actually be quite a good spot on an NPZ or something, because they're quite distinguishable. You can see it's quite easy to see from a distance, so quite a good pole. And here's a unique one for Czechia and Slovakia, these double poles. So even though this pole here is quite generic, to stack 2 of them together for no apparent reason is very, very much a thing to do in Czechia and Slovakia. So if you see these right up next to each other touching, then you know you're going to be somewhere there. Okay, and this one, here we are in Slovakia, and so we can run through these because these are the exact same clues. I mean, Czechia and Slovakia, notoriously difficult to tell apart, but just remember they have the same kind of poles, and that's about all we need to say. Apart from the fact that I think Slovakia may slightly more so use wooden poles. That's my conjecture. Tell me if I'm wrong in the comments. All right, next one here. Here we are in Hungary, and Hungarian poles are noticeable because, as opposed to Polish poles, they have holes that go all the way down to the bottom. You can see the poles end inside the ground, whereas in Polish poles, they'll have this gap at the top here, and they'll also have a gap at the bottom where it's filled in with concrete. And so you can tell that it's not going to be a Polish pole just based on that, which is really useful. Okay, moving on, we have a thicker Hungarian pole here. This one's probably more common in Romania, or at least a similar looking pole is more common in Romania, but this is kind of the thick version of the last one, wholly all the way through. You can see if we move over here that it's wholly and quite see-through indeed. Okay, and here's the last one for Hungary. They do use a decent amount of wooden poles, and often they're in A-frames, sometimes standalone as well. One thing I have noticed about Hungary is that they often have like a very short like light on the pole, which is something you may choose to use, but I'm not really sure how reliable that is. Alright, so next one here, we are over now in Russia, and Russia is very distinctive in the fact that they almost always use these squared off, so not round, but squared poles, which are made of concrete, and they normally have like a metal bar at the top. And yeah, here you can see a whole bunch of them. I found a nice field. You can also see some round ones here. This one actually might be made of metal, but you can also see some round ones. And yeah, I don't know, but generally speaking, this is the typical Russian one. And so to move on here, we also have this one. It's a more rounded one, and I'm not really sure how common these are, but I have seen them every now and again in Russia. And that one's rounded instead of square, but square is the one you need to know. Okay, moving on to Estonia here, we have a squared off pole, the similar way we would in Russia, squared off concrete pole. And yeah, Estonia is one of these countries that uses a combination, and often you'll have these supports at the bottom, and this one is a wooden pole here. And but you can see here's some more of those concrete poles that we mentioned. So kind of an even mix in Estonia, maybe slightly more concrete in my opinion, but generally speaking, quite a mix over there. Here we are in and here's a couple of A-frames, and of course, if you don't know this, then it definitely bears mentioning that in the Baltics, all three of the Baltic nations, A-frame poles are exceptionally common, and you'll see at least half poles probably using A-frames, and so here we have an example of a concrete A-frame pole and a wooden A-frame pole, and that's still both Estonia. And so here we are in Latvia, which is kind of an anomaly in the fact that it's an ex-Soviet Union country that uses mostly wooden poles, so it's a good way to remember it. And Latvia uses oftentimes three or four or something like that, bulbs on either side alternating in this very specific way. So you will see other alternating bulb countries, but in Latvia they're often quite spread out, and they're quite common on their poles. So here's another example here, and yeah, they're quite common on the poles, and you can find it all throughout Latvia, and it's very useful indeed. But you can see it in the other Baltic countries rarely, so you have to be careful as well. And so here we just have like a standard wooden A-frame pole as well in Latvia, and you can see some other examples here of how they commonly look. But yeah, this one as well, very much worth keeping in mind. Okay, here we are in, I believe, Lithuania, and Lithuania is kind of similar to Estonia and Russia in the fact that it uses this kind of style, but as opposed to the other Baltics, it tends to have like very tiny bulbs, and many of them at the top of poles. So that's one example, and here's some more examples. A lot of small bulbs at the top, and here we have some more concrete A-frames. Yeah, I've just brought this one up as an intersection full of them, so worth keeping in mind. And also this metal thing at the top is quite common in Lithuania. This is a metal attachment at the top of the concrete A-frames, and so yeah, this is another example of it here, and quite common over there. Can be seen in other ones, but here's another example of these small bulbs as well. Okay, and then lastly is Ukraine, which is basically, I would say, exactly the same as Russia. Here's an example of a squared off one, and also you will occasionally see rounded ones, probably more commonly than in Russia, in Ukraine as well. And not to mention that often in the Soviet countries like that I've mentioned so far, they'll paint poles at the bottom white. It's quite common to do over there. Common in other countries as well, but Ukraine's definitely a country where you'll see that quite a lot. Here we are in Poland, and Poland has these holy poles that have holes that don't reach the top or the bottom. So we have like holes in the middle, but they never reach the top or the bottom as far as I know, and it's a very good way of getting Poland as opposed to the other countries where, seeing this gap at the top and the bottom would be very rare indeed. Okay, so now we are over in Romania, and Romania uses, generally speaking, the thicker version of the holy poles more often than they do in Hungary, even though these two countries can be very hard to distinguish because of their similar poles. But also, what's worth noting here is that there's often a yellow paint job or a yellow sticker on the side of Romanian ones, which you can see elsewhere as well, but is most common over there and quite common indeed to see. Okay, here we are again in Romania. They also use the kind of holy pole that's the kind of thinner version, and again the poles will go all the way to the bottom like that, and so it makes it nice and easy to tell that you're not in Poland at least. And often I find that in urban areas of Romania, we just use the standard non-holy poles that are just round, and you can also just kind of see a mix of poles in urban areas. The holy poles, obviously, you can see in urban areas as well, but are more commonly. It's more common to just have homogeneous holy poles out in the countryside. Okay, and one thing to note before I move on to Bulgaria is that often Romania is that country as well that paints a lot of the bottom of their poles white, and also trees as well. Okay, here we are in Bulgaria, and the standard Bulgarian pole is just a rounded concrete one, and so nice and easy to remember, although it's going to be, one of the ones where poles are not as useful as in other countries. And here we are with a unique Bulgarian pole, to contradict what I just said. This one has alternating, kind of similar to Latvia, except these kind of bulbs look very different to the ones in Latvia. And this is also on a concrete pole as well. And so this particular one, if you can remember it, is a unique pole. Okay, here we are in Bulgaria still, and we have this smaller mesh, kind of one that the kind of pole that runs through a town. So you can see this is just in the middle of a town, and yeah, you can often see that in Bulgaria. They tend to use quite a few of these mesh ones. Being so close to Turkey, Turkey's a country that uses a lot of these, so don't get confused. Okay, next one here, we are still in Bulgaria, and we have a sectioned pole. Just thought I'd include this because I found it's not particularly common at all, but you can also have these kind of sectioned poles in Bulgaria as well every now and again. Okay, here we are in North Macedonia, and we have a wooden pole. Actually, no, this one, it says Macedonia at the top. No, this one was Greece, and the good way to tell Greece and North Macedonia apart, or one good way to tell Greece and the rest of the world apart, is that Greek poles are particularly tall. This is a wooden pole, but it's just a very tall tree that they've actually managed to use for this one. And you can see that all throughout Greece. Now, not all Greek wooden poles are going to be this tall, but it's very common to have ones that are particularly tall. So don't rely on this too much, but if you're just like looking at this NMPZ and you see, oh, that's quite a tall pole, really, then you may be in Greece. And here's another example here, which is this one here. And also, like, Greek poles tend to have like this kind of strong, like, brown wooden color to them. The other one that I showed didn't so much, but they're often this color. So if you can also get that, then that might be useful for you as well. Okay, here we are now, I believe, in North Macedonia. Yeah, we've got some Cyrillic here. And this one is a North Macedonian pole, actually quite tall as well. So maybe it's not the best way to distinguish them apart, but yeah, this one's also kind of abnormally tall. And here we have another North Macedonian one. They also just use the standard European pole, we could say, quite often as well. And also metal mesh ones as well. So North Macedonia is kind of a mixed country where you can't use poles that well. And also here we have this similar one that I told you about for Italy, and this is the same pole top you get in North Macedonia as well. Okay, moving on, I believe we are in Albania here, and Albania uses the standard European pole quite often. It's probably their main pole, I would say. And then they also use wooden poles as well, kind of standalone wooden poles are decently common. And then also we've got this standalone metal pole, which is kind of like a strange one, but I actually did see it quite a few times in Albania. Quite a unique one. I'm not sure if it's actually fully unique to Albania, but definitely one you see there every now and again. And here is what I was saying before. Czechia and Slovakia are joined by Albania with this detached metal pole top, which is very distinguishable from a distance there. So good to keep in mind. Okay, now we are moving on to Montenegro, which uses the standard poles. And I found that in Montenegro, they're often a bit thinner than you would probably see in the other countries that we mentioned so far. They're a little thicker elsewhere. So Montenegro, a little bit thinner is what I'd say. And then Montenegro also sometimes uses these metal mesh ones, which are often rusted. So you can use those, and even see, you can see these like similar to a Latvian one looking poles here. So again, you can't use any of these tips, or most of these tips aren't 100% effective, especially in Europe where borders are so close to one another, and it's there's a lot of shared culture, and so it's particularly with poles. Europe's a little scary like that. And here we are in Croatia, and the Croatian poles, I would also say, do also have a tendency to be a bit thinner, although I'm less confident about that than with North Macedonia. But yeah, we're using the standard one here. And here we are using a wooden pole as well. Often has like the support like that in Croatia, I would say. And here we are in Belgrade as well. And I don't know why I actually brought this one up. this one's looking fairly similar to the last ones. Okay, so moving on, oh, that's because we're in Serbia. Right, so here we are in Serbia, and again, another standard one. Got some metal brackets around here. I think that's fairly common in Serbia as well. And, okay, here we have as well a metal mesh one. And metal mesh ones are quite common in Serbia. I almost considered on my map here putting Serbia as a combination of metal and concrete, but really concrete is quite a bit more common over there. So I don't think you really need to worry about that. But yeah, you do see these quite often in northern towns as well. That's my conjecture. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but that's what I thought. Okay, here we are on the next one. This one is the kind of pole top that you see in Italy, and also you can see it in Serbia. And here we have as well a metal mesh, which is a larger one, and you can also see those fairly common in Serbia as well. Okay, and our last country here is Slovenia. Slovenia also uses the same standard pole, but I would say more common is to actually see wooden poles in Slovenia. Slovenia is kind of like an outlier in Eastern Europe in the fact that it uses quite a lot of wooden poles, and it's also a country, one of these countries that I've mentioned, that does not use too many poles to begin with. So, but yeah, if you see a wooden pole and it looks Eastern Europe, maybe consider Slovenia, although you can't really trust these things all too much. Okay, let's finally move on to some other continents now, because Europe was the biggest one by far. And so yeah, guys, I'm ending off the European section with that location. Later tonight, I'm going to be uploading the second part, which will be linked in the description as well. That's for the rest of the world. You're going to want to check that out because obviously it's essential viewing. And yeah, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Smash like for all that extra effort that I put in for this one, and I'll see you guys in the video soon. Goodbye.